Editor doubts a black writer's talent, but what happens next shocks everyone. Before we get into the story, drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? Late October, 1983. Boston hung thick with damp air, and the chill that settled in just before winter took hold. In Dorchester, the streets were slowly choking on fallen leaves. On the second floor of a crumbling red brick triple-decker, in a neighborhood stitched together by barely getting by families, Amir Grayson was typing the final paragraph of his manuscript. Unaware he was not just finishing a draft, but quietly closing the door on a version of his life. His apartment was sparse but entirely his. Creaky wood floors, a radiator that popped and ticked like it was counting down something, and windows taped with plastic against the cold. Nothing fancy, nothing decorative. But the silence was his. The shelves lined with worn books were his. The lingering smell of old paper and stale coffee, abandoned hours ago, his too. Spread across the table in front of him were pages upon pages, covered in dark ink and furious edits. He clung to the manuscript like a man adrift holding onto wreckage. He'd worked on it for nearly a year. During gaps between lectures at the city college, in the dead of night when the guy upstairs yelled at his television, on weekends when his sister begged him to at least step outside for air. But now with the last line written, there was no relief, no pride, just that familiar, dull emptiness. He had no idea if the work meant anything, and honestly, he'd stopped believing anyone wanted to hear what he had to say a long time ago. The novel was called Deeper Than the Dirt, a title too plain, too earnest, too unliterary for anyone sipping cocktails in a publishing office high above Park Avenue. But inside the book was a story, a real one. The story of their father, Elijah Grayson, a construction worker who died digging the tunnel beneath the Charles River. The book opened on that day, the sharp ring of the phone, a man's voice saying something he couldn't remember now. Celeste's scream. She was barely 12. Then came the silence. That slow, awful hush no one ever bothered to fill. Not the mayor, not the union, not the cops. Black men died on sites like that and disappeared into statistics. Amir just wanted, for once, for one of those men to take up a whole page, not just a footnote. He stood, stretching the tightness out of his shoulders. Streetlights spilled through the plastic-sealed window, dancing off the puddles below. Somewhere nearby, brakes screeched in the dark. He flicked off the lamp and walked into the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water, not hearing the soft creak of the front door opening behind him. Celeste had always had a way of showing up quietly, like a shadow slipping into the room. Thin, short curls framing her serious face, hoodie sleeves half chewed from nervous habit. She worked 2 jobs, a diner and a laundromat, and still found time to take care of him, though she'd never say it like that. "You done?" she asked, scanning the room with a glance that missed nothing. He nodded, not turning to face her. "I think so. Not that it matters." She stepped over to the desk, trailing a fingertip along the edge of the paper. "You always say that, and then you write again anyway." He didn't answer. Something in her gaze made him feel small, like she could see the way he shrank from his own ambition. She never said it aloud, but he knew. She didn't doubt his talent. She doubted his will, like he'd built failure into himself as a kind of armor, just so the blows wouldn't hurt as much when they landed. 3 days later, the manuscript was gone. It had sat on the dresser under a heavy copy of Balzac, neatly stacked, untouched. Now it wasn't. The envelope and entry form, gone too. Amir didn't even notice until that evening, when an unfamiliar chill took root in his chest. He tore through the apartment, flipping through drawers, scanning every surface. But deep down he already knew. Only one person knew where he kept the forms. Only one person had the nerve to do something like this. Celeste. She didn't admit it right away. A week later, across the kitchen table, a chipped mug of cheap tea in her hand, she said it the way someone might talk about ordering takeout. I sent it to that contest, the one from the newspaper, the Whitfield Prize. Your book, she paused, choosing her words carefully. It can't just sit here collecting dust. Someone should read it, even if it's just one person. He didn't yell, didn't even respond, just stood up and walked outside. He drifted through the neighborhood, heading toward the old docks, past busted-up cars and graffiti-covered storefronts, past people who looked at him with the same dull expression he wore in the mirror. Tired. Number waiting for something to change but expecting nothing. Teaching had become mechanical. He taught American literature at a community college near Roxbury. Baldwin, Morrison, Henry James, Faulkner, trying to bridge some impossible gap between white canon and his own fractured legacy. But half the students didn't know who Baldwin was. They stared at him like he was just another city employee punching a clock. He couldn't even blame them. It chipped away at him every day, a quiet erosion, like something dying inside piece by piece. As for publishing, he'd sent excerpts to journals, magazines, small presses. The replies were always the same: dry, polite rejections. Does not align with our editorial direction. Content unsuitable for current themes. Or worse, silence. Life moved on, groaning forward like a poorly greased machine. The subway screeched, kids yelled in the courtyard, the news talked about elections, inflation, some movie-breaking box office records. But inside Amir, something was building. Pressure, static. He didn't know what it was for. Still, he kept writing. When the letter arrived a month and a half later, thick envelope, crisp, with the Whitfield Prize seal and his name typed cleanly across the front, he stared at it for a long time before opening it. He held it like it might disappear if he moved too fast. And then he read, "We are pleased to inform you that your manuscript, Jojo Deeper Than the Dirt, has been selected as a finalist for the Whitfield Prize for American Letters." He sat down, then stood, then sat again. His heart thundered in his ears. He couldn't make sense of the words. He, Amir Grayson, was a finalist. The other names were who he expected. 3 white authors, all Ivy League, all already published, already praised. And then, him. Later that night, he looked at Celeste. "You did this," he said, almost in a whisper. She nodded but didn't smile. Her eyes were steady, serious. She understood what he hadn't said out loud. Everything had changed. And maybe not for the better. Because in a world where people like Amir were usually scenery in someone else's story, the sound of his voice making it to the final round was a kind of rebellion. And like any rebellion, it came with risk, with consequences. He didn't know if he was ready, but ready or not, the fire had been lit. November. Mornings in Back Bay didn't start with the rumble of garbage trucks or the clatter of school children's voices. No, here. Mornings began with the rustling of Boston Globe, papers left at townhouse doorsteps, the smell of fresh baguettes from the bakery on the corner, and the muffled barking of pedigreed dogs being walked in perfectly pressed coats. Time didn't rush here. Reality was always a little polished, a little too perfect. White marble facades gleamed, dark lacquered doors reflected the early light, and brass plaques bearing the names of lawyers, surgeons, architects adorned the walls. And behind one of those windows, framed by an iron cornice, stood Robert Mason. In his robe, with a cup of coffee in hand, he stared at the letter that had arrived the day before. He'd read it twice already, but still felt uneasy, not intellectually, but in a way that was almost physical, annoying. The letter was from Francis Lovejoy, the chair of the Whitfield Prize jury, with a polite but insistent request. "Take a look at this manuscript, Robert. It's off format, but there's something to it. Maybe we're all missing something." The word rushed maybe. Unsettled Mason. He hated maybe. He preferred categorization, analysis of components, style, structure, references, tradition. He didn't believe in intuition, especially not the kind born from the desire to discover new voices. After nearly 20 years in the publishing world, he'd seen enough of those discoveries, most of them weak, half-formed attempts to write from another's perspective, usually laced with exoticism and political self-righteousness. But this manuscript, he found it among the final submissions, Deeper Than the Dirt, by Amir Grayson. The manuscript had arrived in a simple envelope, without an agent's cover letter, without any recommendations. The print was sloppy, the lines veering off to the right, with typewriter errors scattered throughout. The cover was just a title page with the author's name and address. Mason scowled. Even at this early stage, he felt like this was going to be not it. He started reading, initially with professional distaste. The introduction seemed overwrought, overloaded with imagery. He jotted notes. Too much emotion, stylistically uneven. What's with the archaic dialogue in the third paragraph? He marked up the margins with sharp pencil strokes, brief phrases. Clarify? Who's speaking here? Why this digression? But something shifted. He found himself forgetting to take notes. Instead of analyzing, he was simply reading. The scene where the protagonist stands over his father's body, drowned on a construction site, hit him hardest. No tears, no dramatic gestures, just the sharp smell of cement and the breath of another worker, trembling with fear, saying, "Nobody's coming, kid. He's gone." It was written simply, almost clinically, and in that simplicity, there was power, not literary finesse, but lived experience, worn down to the bone. He hated himself for being affected by it. Later, he told himself maybe Grayson didn't write it himself. Maybe a talented professor helped him, or a more experienced friend edited the draft. Maybe Grayson had just transcribed someone else's story. Or worse, maybe he'd read a lot of Baldwin and tried to copy him. But even Baldwin, yes, even Baldwin didn't write like this. With such restraint, with such stubborn refusal to explain. It pissed Mason off. He went to his study and opened a bottle of scotch. The house was quiet. Caroline, his wife, had gone to New York. Some art show, discussions about form, color, and emotional contours and texture. He had long stopped understanding what she meant. They once shared a space of thought. Now they only shared walls. He sat by the window staring at the copies of the manuscript spread out on the table. It wasn't the aesthetics that bothered him, not the plot, not the form. What got to him was what he felt as he read it, as though the text was speaking to him in a language he had long forgotten. He searched for flaws. He reread and underlined. Abrupt transition. Unjustified flashback. Dialect not clarified. White audience won't get it. And each time he thought, well, finally, here's the weak spot. It turned into something real. Something messy, something ugly, but undeniably true. He even wrote a note to Francis. Strange choice. Without editing, this manuscript risks being misunderstood. Maybe the author needs an editor to adapt his style for a wider audience. But he didn't send it, because deep down he knew. This wasn't about adaptation. It was about control, about turning the manuscript into something he'd seen 100 times before. In the morning, he called the prize committee and asked for the author's contact details. When they gave him the phone number for the college where Amir Grayson taught, he wrote it down on a scrap of paper from Joshua Houghton Mifflin without thinking. He stared at the note for a long time. Then he dialed the number. Amir answered through his secretary. His voice was soft, restrained, without the slightest attempt to impress. Mason introduced himself, said he'd like to discuss the manuscript, suggested meeting in person. Grayson agreed without hesitation, as if checking a box. No joy, no excitement. Like he expected things to go just like always. Mason hung up the phone and sat back in his chair. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something, but he still believed. This was just an error, a coincidence. Someone had decided to add diversity to the list, and he, Robert Mason, as the senior editor, as someone who'd grown up among the first editions of Henry James and his father's critiques, as someone who understood, was supposed to restore order. What he didn't know yet was that order would be disrupted, not in the manuscript, but in him, that the fear of a true voice went much deeper than he'd realized, because this voice was coming from a part of America he'd never bothered to see, not because he was afraid, but because he'd learned not to notice. Robert Mason hated spring in Boston, especially May, when the city sweltered under sticky sunlight and students flooded the streets in their ridiculous Harvard jackets, as if everyone had some grand plan for the future. To him, it all felt like the city was buzzing with false hope, a hope that had nowhere to go. And of course, it was right then that he found himself wrapped up in work he considered utterly pointless. He had booked Amir Grayson's ticket on the early train from New Haven, didn't want to waste time with emails or phone calls, a direct invitation, sharp, almost commanding. Inside, frustration bubbled. The prize jury, that old liberal Lovejoy, had sent him this damn manuscript, and all he saw in it was a mess. No structure, no voice, no real literary merit. Just pretentious scenes overloaded with authenticity and political subtext. He was sure of one thing. If there was anything dangerous in today's literary world, it was the desire to represent everyone, even when there was nothing to represent. Amir arrived on time, wearing a gray blazer that hung on him like it wasn't his. He was thin, with hard features, and a tired look in his eyes that was both focused and distant. In his hands, a thin folder with notes, battered with crumpled corners. His gait was like someone always bracing to be stopped and asked to prove they had a right to be there. They met in Robert's editorial office in the old mansion on Beacon Hill, a cozy neighborhood where elegance disguised centuries of isolation. Inside, massive oak bookshelves lined the walls. The smell of tobacco lingered in the air. A worn rug covered the floor, and portraits of dead white writers stared down from every corner. The whole atmosphere served as a reminder. You're an outsider here, and you'll stay one until you prove otherwise. Robert gestured for Amir to sit. He didn't offer coffee. "Thanks for coming," he said, not looking up. "Let's get straight to it. We're going to work on your manuscript. Intensely. I need to make sure it holds up for final consideration." On the table lay a copy of the manuscript, riddled with red ink. Too blunt. Unnecessary scene. The reader won't get it. Robert believed he was doing real literature, the kind that fit into a form, that had rhythm and subtext. He thought his job was to clean the text of noise and pretension. Anything that didn't match this vision was weakness. Amir didn't argue. At first, he nodded, took notes, but wrote little. In the evenings, he'd sit in his tiny apartment in Dorchester, paid for with what was left of his teaching salary. The floor creaked, the light was weak, and the sound of buses passing outside filled the air. He held an old notebook in his hands, the very one he started with. Inside, it wasn't chapters, but voices. His father shouting through a tunnel of dust, his mother reading the newspaper like she was looking for answers between the lines. Childhood stained with the smell of metal and gasoline. None of it could be edited. It was part of his blood. Working with Robert was painful. He suggested replacing the scenes with subway workers with more universal references. He asked him to remove a moment where the protagonist faces a cop, saying, "This feels like a complaint, not literature." Every time Amir felt like his voice was being squeezed into a mold, he knew if he accepted these changes, his text would become safe and dead. Sometimes Robert held seminars with publishing interns, literary consultants. Amir would sit off to the side listening as confident young white women talked about the potential for cross-cultural dialogue or the influence of post-colonial optics. He didn't intervene. He knew they weren't discussing the text. They were discussing him as a social phenomenon. Only Caroline, Robert's wife, sometimes became an unexpected point of quiet. She would come into the office to drop off lunch for Robert or to pick up paints from the studio. Her gaze sliding over Amir wasn't hostile. He felt she saw something in him that Robert didn't, a pain that didn't ask for approval. One day when the rain was coming down in buckets, they stayed late at the office. Robert was once again pointing out the scenes with the protagonist's father, saying they were bogged down with unnecessary details. Amir asked, "Do you really not care what it's like to be among those who build the cities where they're not allowed to live?" Robert sighed but didn't answer. To him, literature was a field of craft, not pain. The next day, Robert brought in a note. "Try rewriting this as an allegory, without directly referencing race. Make it more universal." Amir didn't argue. He left that night, where the air smelled of fish and cigarettes. And that night, in the modest quiet of his apartment, he wrote a new scene. Not an allegory, but a voice, without excuses, just like the first time. He knew it wouldn't pass, but he had to remind himself why he started writing in the first place. The work continued. The tension between them became almost physical. Robert, despite his irritation, began to understand. This man had something that didn't fit into his method. Something stubborn, something raw, something he couldn't control. And that frustrated him more than anything. But deep down, barely noticeable, a crack began to form. Robert started setting aside some pages, not to edit them, just to read them. Something in Amir's voice pierced through, though he didn't want to admit it. Not aloud, not yet. And so they worked. Two people bound by the same task, but speaking different languages. One with the desire to translate, the other with a desperate attempt to preserve the original. It was a work in the shadows, not of success or recognition, but of pain, through which maybe the real thing was being born. Robert Mason had always despised sentimentality. His office was free of clutter, a white desk with a light dusting of tobacco ash, the rectangular slice of sunlight from the window creeping slowly across the carpet, and books, dozens, hundreds, lined up like soldiers on parade. He clung to order like it was the last proof of control, over the text, over himself, over a life that seemed long past being his ally. Outside, Boston was wrapping itself in the late autumn chill. Cold, noisy, gray, with the smell of wet leaves and hot coffee spilling out from the corners of Boylston Street. But here in his office, it was dry, like a library where thoughts die before they get discussed. Amir sat across from him, arms crossed, almost as if he were protecting himself. This was the third time he'd been here this week, and despite the seeming politeness, there was still a thick wall between them. Robert spoke in clipped tones, never looking Amir in the eye. His edits were precise but insistent. Take out this comparison, explain this scene, trim the dialogues, it's throwing off the rhythm. Amir nodded, took notes, but made hardly any changes. And at first, Robert had been angry at his stubbornness, but now he began to feel something strange, almost envy, for Amir's ability to stay true to himself, as though Amir were safe outside the confines of literary taste. But that day, everything shifted. Robert was flipping through the folder where Amir had tucked away extra materials, notes, snippets, drafts, things that didn't fit into the structure of the novel, but might come in handy. Among them, he found a sheet of paper, faded, with typewritten text and a few handwritten lines. No title, no date. Just a stream of speech, raw, unedited, almost conversational, as though someone were sitting on a porch recalling, "You want to know who I was before the hard hat? Ask me why my hands can't hold children anymore. Just a shovel. When we were called to dig, we dug. When beams fell, we stayed silent. Because if a black worker shouts, he gets fired. But if he stays quiet, he dies inside. I've died inside about 20 times while you were learning how to speak proper. Robert read it twice, then again. He didn't know who was speaking, a character or Amir's real father. But the voice cut through him. Not literary, not stylized, no metaphors. A voice that didn't belong among the award finalists. A voice he had spent his life avoiding, and now he couldn't help but hear. He didn't tell Amir what he had read. At first he wanted to, then he didn't. He simply asked casually where Amir had learned to write with such depth of breath. Amir shrugged as if the question were foolish. I've been writing since I was 15, Amir said. Nobody read it. I didn't even reread it, mostly burned it. Robert remembered the first time he showed his father an essay on Henry James at 16. His father said nothing, just underlined 2 sentences in red and wrote in the margins. You're trying to sound smarter than you are. And since then, he'd truly been trying. A silence fell between them. Robert stood and walked to the window. Through the glass, he could see the autumn shadows stretching across the brick walls of the old buildings. As ancient as Boston itself, with their weathered cornices, faded signs, and flags they loved to hang, even when it wasn't a holiday. The city felt made up, almost theatrical, like a stage where a black writer still seemed like an accident. You know, Robert said finally, your father sounds like no one's ever heard him before. Amir nodded, but didn't smile. That's how it was. From that moment on, something subtle but palpable shifted between them. Robert started looking at the text differently. He didn't stop editing. He couldn't. It was deeper than instinct, almost a part of his identity. But now he wasn't searching for mistakes, but for reasons to understand. He began asking questions, not to fix things, but to listen. Why is he silent in this scene? Who is looking at him in the crowd? Where does the boy get these words? And in response, he heard things that made something inside him tremble. Amir spoke uncertainly, like someone who had been made to doubt their own truth too many times. But he spoke, and for the first time, Robert felt. He wasn't leading the conversation. He was following. Meanwhile, Robert's home life was cracking. Caroline was barely coming home anymore. Her canvases sat in the studio, the smell of oil paint reminding him of an aching emptiness. She'd called to say she'd be at a friend's or that her exhibit had been postponed, but there was no substance to these calls. It was as if everything they didn't say spoke louder than anything they did. He once tried to tell her about Amir, but she just said, maybe you see in him what you're afraid of in yourself, and hung up. With each passing day, he felt it more. It wasn't about the book. It was about the fact that he'd spent his life believing in one kind of literature, polished, controlled, European educated, where emotion had to be clever and pain refined. And now before him was something different, raw, at times out of place, too physical, but honest. It was the voice of someone who had never lived within the literary framework, a voice that no one had asked permission to hear. Robert began rereading what he'd once considered errors. He stopped correcting scenes where workers smoked in the basement, where the mother cries without saying a word, where the white foreman calls Amir's father the dark horse. Scenes that in another book he would have cut as excessive. Now he left them because he realized it wasn't his place to decide which scenes in this life were excessive. By the end of the week, he returned Amir's manuscript nearly unchanged. Amir flipped through it, not hiding his surprise. You sure? Robert just nodded and said the words he'd never said to an author in 20 years of editing. For the first time, I feel like the text is stronger than me. It wasn't surrender, it was a rare form of respect, the kind that comes when you're finally capable of listening. Outside, the snow had begun to fall slowly. The first snow of the season, dry, sparse, resting on the rooftops of Boston like a forgotten memory that not everyone gets to know. Robert looked at the white specks on the glass and thought about those who hadn't been read, about Amir's father, about his own father, who never knew how to just be a person, not a critic, and about himself, the person who was only now beginning to realize how many voices in his life he hadn't heard because he hadn't considered it worth listening to. But now he heard, and there was no turning back. By the time Robert Mason flipped through the printed pages of the novel for the last time, it was already late in the evening. Outside, the deep Boston fall was settling in. Damp, gray, filled with the scent of rotting leaves and worn-out words hanging on the walls of his editorial office, where every stroke, every comma, had been given special weight. But that night, the room felt unusually quiet. No creaking chair, no tapping fingers on the wooden armrest. He just sat there, staring at the text, which no longer lay before him as an object to be edited, but as something finished. Something that had been finished, not by him. At first, he thought it was going according to the usual script. Young author, weak structure, unnecessary scenes, raw emotions, the social context needing to be translated for the reading public. White, educated, unwilling to feel uncomfortable. But with every new read-through, his edits seemed increasingly superficial. He'd strike out dialogues only to put them back the next morning. He'd try replacing phrases, but the author's words, raw and alive, would come back as if refusing to be stolen or reworded. And then he just stopped touching the text altogether. Amir Grayson seemed to sense this. Their last meetings had passed in a rhythm of silence. Sitting at the table, piled high with papers, no one rushing to break the quiet. Sometimes Amir would trace a finger along a paragraph, almost as if rereading his own pain. Other times he'd stare out the window, where the dull glass reflected not the city, but his father's face, carved from coal and exhaustion. Robert no longer offered advice, not because he couldn't, but because he had finally understood. Amir's voice was not a draft. It was a voice that didn't need permission. Robert suddenly remembered the time his father, a critic, sharp and biting, had torn apart the debut novel of a Southern writer saying, "This novel wants to be a scream, but all it has is a squeak." At the time, Robert had admired that judgment. Now it sounded like mockery of pain, like a closed door. He began to realize how much of the literary system he'd adored wasn't about listening. It was about filtering, cleansing, neutralizing. That same night, he wrote a letter to the Whitfield Prize Committee. He sat at his typewriter and, like in the old movies, without drafts, without pauses, without edits, pounded out a text full of restrained anger and unexpected clarity. As an editor, I would have been expected to offer revisions. However, after months of working with this text, I've come to the conclusion that any change would be a betrayal. This is not a novel that needs to be translated. It's a novel that needs to be heard, without filters, without white commentary, without the usual context explanation. This voice is valuable not because it came from nowhere, but because it came from there, from places our literature usually ignores. He knew that by doing this, he was putting his position at risk. His name at the publishing house had always been spoken with respect. He selected clean texts, knew how to work with prose like a restorer works with frescoes. But this novel, this author, they didn't lend themselves to restoration. They weren't dirty, they were foreign, and that was something else entirely. Monday morning, when he handed the letter to the publisher's editor-in-chief, the reaction was quick and cold. A call to the office, a heavy, almost legal conversation, as if he had violated not a contract, but the corporate faith in literary propriety. "You want us to get torn apart by critics for negligence?" Someone had snapped. Another added, "All this engaged realism is trendy again, but it doesn't sell." Robert didn't argue. He simply said, "If this novel loses, let it lose as it is, not as a compromise." Caroline, his wife, noticed the change in him. Not immediately. He still sat in silence at dinner, still read before bed. But in his silence, there was no longer exhaustion, only focus. One rare night, when they were both in the kitchen, She quietly said, "You look like, for the first time in 10 years, you're speaking not for someone else, but for yourself." He didn't answer, but he felt it. This novel was like a mirror, where he hadn't tried to see himself, but had tried to see someone else. Amir, on the other hand, expected nothing. He'd never hoped for the editor, but when Robert returned the manuscript with no changes, just a note saying, "This is your text, let it remain as it is." Amir sat alone in his apartment for a long time, where the wallpaper was peeling from the walls, and the kettle seemed to keep boiling in the heavy air. He didn't celebrate. He wasn't happy. He simply got up, sat down at the table as a habit, opened a blank notebook, grabbed a pen, and started writing something new. Because for the first time in his life, someone hadn't tried to rewrite his voice. The book went to the printers. No revisions, no simplifications. With hard chapters about black construction workers, with dialogues teetering on the edge of rage, with descriptions that, to most, made the white reader feel guilty. Robert didn't know if it would sell, but he knew one thing. He wasn't supposed to be another white guy who demanded clarity. And so, the work on the novel ended, without applause, without reviews, without awards. But with something that perhaps was more important, the silent agreement between two men, raised on opposite ends of America, who found a language where there was no need to translate. The evening was warm, for late October at least. In Boston, where autumn usually felt dry, prickly, like the rustling of leaves underfoot, the air had suddenly become soft, even fragile, like something important was about to happen. And time itself had paused, delicately parting the curtains for a scene where every glance, every word, had to resonate deeper than usual. At the entrance to the old city cultural center, shabby on the outside but with a grand hall inside, the invited crowd had gathered. Critics, writers, judges, the university elite, a couple of reporters with recorders, and those who had come simply to see if someone like him could actually walk on stage. Amir stood backstage in the dark, half turned to the stage, watching the thin crack between the velvet curtains. He wore his father's old jacket, the only thing left from a man who had left too soon and too quietly. The jacket was slightly too big in the shoulders, and Amir could feel it, like an unfamiliar touch. His palms were sweaty, his heart beating with a dull thud, not quickened. No, quite the opposite. Each beat was slow and heavy, like the toll of a bell in thick fog. He wasn't sure if anyone else could hear it. Robert Mason had been sitting in the hall for a while, silently in the third row, with his back straight and his face set in a still expression. He wore a new suit, a little looser than usual, as if his skin no longer held him as tightly. Next to him sat Caroline, for the first time in ages, not as the shadow of his exhaustion, but as her own figure, calm, composed, with lively eyes. She took his hand the moment the host announced the name. Amir Grayson, finalist for the Whitfield Prize for his novel, The Depth of the Tunnel. The applause started, polite but tepid. Some clapped sincerely, others with barely disguised disdain. Another attempt to give voice to the marginalized, but nothing more. A few were simply waiting for the reception with wine and hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere was tense, as though Amir's very presence stirred a quiet itch in the crowd. An uncomfortable feeling. A black man from the outskirts of the academic world, bringing a text that didn't flatter, didn't try to please, didn't bend to the white reading public. It irritated them. He stepped onto the stage without hurrying, each step seemingly measured. The spotlight hit his eyes, but Amir didn't blink. He pulled the manuscript from his inner jacket pocket, already published, but still almost untouched by readers. The book, now labeled a challenge, a statement, a bold but awkward step, depending on who you asked. He didn't thank anyone. He didn't greet the crowd. He simply began to read. The passage was about the tunnel, about the darkness where his father worked, where men spoke to each other only with gestures, where the wet walls were the only mirrors, where fear was a companion but not an enemy. He read slowly without affectation, his voice almost flat, but because of that, each word felt heavier, like it was being hammered into the air of the hall. He read about a man who built the city but died before he could see it, and about a boy who heard everything, every groan, every nail, every forgotten evening alone. The room was almost completely silent. Only someone coughed at the end of the seventh row. Someone whispered, "This is taking too long." But most remained silent, because in Amir's voice, there was no complaint, just presence, just truth. Robert watched him and suddenly he realized he envied him, not for the success, not for the text, but for the very ability to speak like that, without needing to explain, to justify, to hide behind style or illusions. He thought he had taught Amir to write properly, but the truth was Amir had taught him to remain silent. That night the prize went to another novel, beautiful, stylish, about post-war America, written by a white professor from Yale. Predictable. Robert didn't even raise an eyebrow. He already knew that this wasn't what mattered. He clapped but didn't stand. After the ceremony, the foyer smelled of cheap champagne, smoked salmon canapes, and perfume. People approached Amir, some reservedly, some with blatant condescension. One professor said, "You know, your text is full of pain. I think that's valuable, even if not always literary." Amir nodded. He had heard that before, at the university, on the street, from editors who suggested he tone down the perspective, from women who said, "You're smart, not like the others." Robert didn't approach him immediately. He stood by the window off to the side, watching Amir navigate through the well-meaning smiles, like a tank cutting through asphalt. Later, their eyes met. Robert nodded. Amir did too. That was enough. Later that night, in the empty house where the walls were silent, like he once was, Robert sat at the table. Before him lay a blank sheet of paper. His father's old typewriter sat on the shelf, covered in dust. He took it down, carefully wiped it off, and slid in the first sheet, and began to write. Not a review, not an article, not a letter to the editor, a letter to his father, the one he never told how much he hated him for talking about books, but never hearing his son's living voice. A letter where he tried to explain what it felt like, to spend years believing you knew what talent, truth, and value were, and then meet someone you didn't understand, but who understood you, and in doing so, saved you. It wasn't a victory. It was laying down arms. The first real one. He started with simple words. "You were right about one thing. Truth is more important than structure, but I only understood that now, from someone you would never have read."